Brachot habaot, ladies, and welcome to our weekly edition of Torah classes. And whether you log on to Torah anytime or to ohelsarah.com, as you know, my usual weekly speech, we are so happy that you log on. We're so excited that you devote yourself to Torah, to the shiurim, to the development, the spiritual development and character of your being, of your soul. And I'm excited to announce that Be'ezrat Hashem, starting after Hanukkah, here in Eretz Israel, here in this base of Ohel Sarah, in this house over here, we're going to be starting our live shiurim to the young girls and also to the women of the neighborhoods, the surrounding areas, and we're so excited about that. We're also going to be giving shiurim in Yerushalayim, so that's such exciting news to give over to everybody. I hope that everybody's in this mode of Chanukah, because we're just 1 week away from the auspicious and illuminating Chag, and I want to dedicate this shiur to the Hashmonaim, Aleim HaShalom, to the Maccabean, the ones who fought the war, and they just didn't fight a physical battle. This was not a materialistic victory. This was a spiritual victory. They put themselves out there, and they fought in order to preserve Yahadut, in order to preserve Judaism. And ladies, in Eretz Yisrael, we've already begun to feel the holiday in the air, already a month and more than a month in advance. Sadly, in the United States, you start to feel Hanukkah because the secular malls start to decorate for the winter holiday, and you could see an orange glow of an electric menorah intertwined with the flickering lights of their Christmas trees. That's the sad state of our Galut. And it could happen that while you're shopping with your child in such a mall, the child might turn to you and ask, "Ima, is Hanukkah like Christmas? I mean, we get presents and they get presents. We light candles and they have all these lit up trees. Plus, our Goyish neighbors even have all those electric lights in and all around their windows, and we have a menorah. So is Hanukkah just a Jewish Christmas?" First of all, ladies, how sad is it if you're living in an area surrounded by Gentile neighbors, where your children and you see their lights and their trees, and that to ask this question. I remember just a couple of years ago, I moved to an area in Lakewood that was sadly filled to capacity with Gentiles, of whom most were anti-Semitic. And around this time, around the time of Hanukkah, I couldn't handle being there. I ran away from there to Brooklyn because I couldn't handle being surrounded by their holiday that was so blatant and in my face, no matter where I turned, no matter where I drove. And it was sad for me to see that the majority of the houses were lit up with Christmas decorations, the whole grounds over there, because it was a gated community. The whole grounds was, you just drove in and you just felt the aura of the tumah of their holiday. And just 2 homes on my block were lit up with a menorah. It was me and another neighbor. I can't express enough how a Jew should not put himself, his children or grandchildren in a situation where that's the majority of what they see. Even if they think they're pioneers in a neighborhood that eventually is going to be swarming with Jews, moving to such a neighborhood, for me at least, was such a critical mistake that I made. I want to say it and I don't want to say it, but I even felt a spiritual decline in me. And some people might not even want to admit that they have it, but they do, in the way they behave, in the way they speak, in the things that they engage in, and they don't even realize how much their environment is affecting them, how much their environment is developing their characteristic. And instead of behaving in a Jewish way, sometimes it'll be a word that we throw, or an action that we take that we shouldn't have taken, or the way we think, or how we respond to things that is not the way we would normally respond. And by the way, that was one of the reasons that actually led me to Eretz Yisrael. It was all happening during the COVID situation, and it was straight from that place that was filled with tumah that I decided to venture out and away from there, Baruch Hashem, and to the Holy Land. And I must say that yes, as difficult and challenging as it might be at times to live in Eretz Yisrael, because the Gemara does say, Eretz Yisrael niknet b'yisurim. Before the Mashiach comes, it's going to be very challenging to live here in Eretz Yisrael. You have to earn it with what? With challenges and nisyonot and different trials and tribulations. But I have to tell you that if you give yourself the time and you're here, nothing and nobody can ever take the place of the Kedusha, of the holiness, the grandeur, and the specialty of this land. And hear my words, and I tell you, nothing and no one. Nothing and no one. Not a big house, not the trees, not the forests, not the beautiful scenery, not the lakes, not anything, not the mountains. Nothing and nobody could replace what you feel here. Just even at a, you know what, I'll give you an example. And I'm sorry that I'm ranting, but I have to tell you, because you know that I just came back, actually just last week, from America, where I was touring all over the United States, making my rounds, and performing, and also giving shiurim. I was hired to come in. And when I came back, first of all, while I was there, I felt the difference, you know. But when I came back here, I think I arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, and right away I had to do some shopping, you know, put some food in the fridge. And Thursday night, I went downstairs to take care of a few things in my machzan, which is the it's like a little storage unit. And right next door to my storage unit, there's a family that happens to be my neighbors. And every Thursday night, what do? From that little storage unit that they have, they sell a cholent, all kinds of cholents and kugels and everything, salatim, everything. When I went down to this area, and I was standing online with all my other neighbors waiting for my cholent, the discussions that we were having with the women that were online with me, it's just an aura. You feel it, what they talk about, what's important to them. I was looking across the way people, just the whole environment was like this Erev Shabbat Kodesh. You just felt it in the air. You felt the Shabbat. There was music blasting, Shabbat music blasting a whole Thursday night. Friday, Bichlal, you hear the neighbors, Shabbat. Where I was living in Lakewood, in that particular place, I didn't hear anything and I didn't hear anybody. It was quiet. I didn't hear not the music of Shabbat blasting anywhere. I didn't hear the sirens of Shabbat going off, informing me that Shabbos is almost near. I didn't hear the neighbors knocking on people's doors saying, Shabbat, Shabbat, be'od 10 dakot, Shabbos is in another 10 minutes. I didn't see people, swarms of people coming out of their homes going to shul, and I mean swarms. I didn't see children and grandchildren I didn't see anything. I saw a lot of Goyish houses. I saw a lot of nice trees. I saw the sun setting. But Shabbat, you didn't feel Shabbat. You didn't even see Shabbat. Each person in his own home kept the Shabbat. So, ladies, nothing and nobody could replace this feeling. And I want to give you all a blessing, a bracha, that you should have the merit, you should have the zchut, not only to want to live here with us, but that it should happen for you sooner than later. Don't give yourself excuses why you pitom can't make it here. Come. And with that ratzon, if you really have that will and determination, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will guide your footsteps just as He did mine, and He's going to bless your journey and keep you safe, Be'ezat Hashem. But going back to the mother in the mall, whose child wants to know, if Hanukkah is just a Jewish Christmas, what do? How do you respond to that child? So, you might tell the child, of course Hanukkah is not like Christmas. Hanukkah has nothing to do with that guy sitting over there in a red suit. Hanukkah isn't about trees and synthetic lights. Hanukkah is about a small group of brave Jews called the Maccabean. The Maccabean fought against the Greek army. And not only did the Maccabean defeat the Greek army, but they recaptured Yerushalayim and the Bet HaMikdash, our holy temple, and they made it possible for us to practice our religion again. So your child nods his head as if he understands. But as you leave the mall with your bag of presents, you can't help but wonder. Hanukkah is a holiday about a holy group of Jews who refused to identify with the dominant non-Jewish culture that surrounded them. Isn't it a little strange that for us, you start to think as this mother, isn't it a little strange that for us right here in this parking lot of this mall between Nordstrom's and Macy's, our culture and their culture seems to mesh and melt into each other? What's going on over here? So you get into your car and hopefully your child's question keeps echoing in your mind. Is this the way I should be living? Is Hanukkah really like Christmas? Is Hanukkah the Jewish Christmas? Is it just a strange coincidence that these two holidays always seem to coincide with one another every single year? What's the mystery behind these two opposing holidays? Ladies, I have good news, and I have not such good news. I'm going to start with the good news. The good news is that Hanukkah is definitely not the Jewish Christmas. It cannot be, and it's not. First of all, Hanukkah predates the dawn of Christianity by about 200 years. So there's no way that the Jewish people copied Christmas. So let's get that out of the way. And if that's the good news, what's the not such good news? Well, it turns out that our children are not the first ones to ask about the significance of Hanukkah. Actually, many secular academic scholars thought about our question as well. And some of them claim that there is no coincidence here at all. They claim that Hanukkah and Christmas coincide with one another because they're actually both derived from the same ancient pagan holiday. Well, what? One second, what? Could that be possible? It can't be. And as you know, I always throw you for a loop before we arrive at the answer, so don't get too nervous over here. Let's talk about this so we can arrive at the truth. In 1947, a secular scholar named Julian Morgenstern, wrote a series of articles that try to trace the roots of Hanukkah to some earlier pagan festivals. And interestingly, throughout the ancient world, pagan cultures often celebrated their holidays around the time that the cold was beginning to settle in, right at the time of the winter solstice, which is the shortest day and the longest night of the year. So Mr. Morgenstern claimed that Hanukkah was most likely modeled after those holidays, in particular, a holiday observed in ancient Syria. That pagan winter holiday involved fire rituals, and whenever the Syrians dedicated a new temple to their pagan gods, they do it on this auspicious day of that holiday, right around the solstice time, right around the winter. So according to Mr. Morgenstern, the Jews are copycats, and our Hanukkah is just an elaborate version of this pagan solstice celebration. That's his ridiculous theory. And I say, well, if the Maccabean be'emet were really just mimicking their pagan contemporaries, boy, would that be a big disappointment. So I'm sure we all want to know what the truth is. Is Hanukkah just a version of that pagan winter holiday that we simply just attach some form of spiritual message to? Is Mr. Morgenstern correct? Or is he a big tipesh? Or is he a big fool? So in order to understand this question, we're going to have to analyze two different sections of the Gemara that will provide us with some answers. And interestingly, when we look at these two passages from the Gemara, we'll figure out how Mr. Morgenstern was indeed correct in one way, but very much wrong, so very wrong in another way. So let's begin with the first Gemara, which is found in the tractate of Shabbat, the Gemara of Shabbat. In this Gemara, we're actually given the source of Hanukkah itself. That's the first Gemara. The second Gemara is found in the tractate of Avodah Zarah, which seems to come out of left field and has nothing to do with Hanukkah at all. But in that passage, there's some evidence that these two Gemariot are somehow connected to each other. And in order to understand either of these passages, we have to understand both. When we understand both teachings of the Gemara, we could arrive at a profound and surprising reality about the true spiritual roots of Hanukkah. So let's begin by going back to that first Gemara of Shabbat in the Talmud Bavli. The Gemara asks, Mai Chanukah? What is Hanukkah? And the Rabbanim answer, Bechav Hei Bekislev, on the 25th day of the month of Kislev, which is the Hanukkah period. For those 8 days, the rabbis tell us, we do not deliver eulogies, nor do we fast. That's the definition of Hanukkah? Wait a second here. I mean, think about it. Do you know what Hanukkah is? We're asking. Do you know what Hanukkah is? Well, the Gemara says that these are the days during which we don't deliver eulogies, nor do we fast. What does that mean? I'm confused. If the Rabbanim ask the question of what is Hanukkah, what would you expect a good one-line answer to be if we're asking that question? Maybe the answer should be a sentence about what it is that we're celebrating. Maybe describe the victory of the war. Perhaps define the miracle of the oil or the preservation of the Jewish faith. Maybe the Rabbanim could have offered the explanation of what we do during this Hanukkah period. They could have explained that we all gather around with our fellow Jews and we light the Hanukkah candles at the entrance of our homes. And after mentioning all these important points, then they could have added a line at the end that read, oh, and since this is a holiday, being that it's a Chag, and we're supposed to be in a celebratory mood, that means there should be no fasting, there should be no mourning or eulogizing over the dead for a period of 8 days. But you wouldn't start explaining Hanukkah by saying it's an 8-day holiday in the middle of winter in which we can't fast or eulogize people. No. So let's go back to that passage of the Gemara. What else do the Rabbanim say about Hanukkah in that passage? Listen to the words. They say, as we said earlier, these are the days we don't eulogize and fast. Why? שכשנכנסו יוונים להיכל, because when the Greeks invaded the Holy Temple, טימאו כל השמנים שבהיכל, they defiled all the pure oil that was in the sanctuary. וכשגברה מלכות בית חשמונאי, and when the kingdom of the Hashmonaim, the Maccabean, when they rose up to do battle against the Greeks, v'nitzchom, and the Maccabean defeated the Greeks, batku, they searched everywhere in the Holy Temple, ve'lo matzu ela pach echad shel shemen, and they couldn't find but one flask of oil, shehaya munach bechotmo shel Cohen gadol, and that flask of oil was still closed with the seal of the Kohen Gadol, of the high priest. ולא היה בו אלא להדליק יום אחד, and that oil was enough only to light the menorah for one single day. נעשה נס, a miracle occurred, והדליקו ממנו 8 ימים, and they were able to light from that oil enough for 8 consecutive days. לשנה אחרת, the following year, קבעום ועשום ימים טובים. They established these 8 days as days of celebration, בהלל והודאה, days to praise and offer thanksgiving to God. So we see from the remainder of this Gemara that maybe this entire business of no fasting or no eulogizing isn't a minor detail of the holiday, but it might actually be a basic definition of the Chag. So let's try to understand this idea by learning the second Gemara found in the Gemara of Avodah Zarah. Over there, the Gemara interestingly discusses 2 pagan holidays. It discusses holidays that are not holidays for us at all, but rather holidays whose origin is pagan. And I guess that's what Mr. Morgenstern was referring to. Now, technically, the Gemara is doing that in order to warn us about things that we have to refrain from doing around the time of those pagan holidays. You see, the Rabbanim wanted us to distance ourselves from anything that resembles pagan practices, Gentile practices, and in the process of warning us, the Gemara informs us of something fascinating about the origin of those pagan holidays. What does the Gemara state? Listen to the words. Amar Rav Hanan bar Rava. Rav Hanan, the son of Rava, alav shalom, said, Kalanda chet yamim achar tkufa. The pagan festival called Kalanda takes place for 8 days following the tkufa. What's a tkufa? A tkufa is referring to the winter solstice. And the Gemara continues, Saturnura chet yamim lifnei tkufa. And the pagan festival of Saturnura takes place during the 8 days leading up to the winter solstice. Oh, and that's very interesting. And then the Gemara goes on to explain where these two pagan holidays came from. The Rabbanim inform us that the story of these two pagan holidays began way back in the days of creation itself, if you could believe it. The Gemara tells us the following. לפי שראה אדם הראשון, יום שמתמעט והולך. Very interesting. It seems that the origin of these pagan holidays dates back to the days of Adam Harishon. The Gemara is telling us that when Adam, the very first man, saw that the days were becoming increasingly shorter. In other words, he experienced what we would call the onset of winter. And we have to remember that Adam was the very first man who ever lived, so he never experienced winter before. So when he saw the days getting shorter, when he saw the darkness descending upon the world earlier, he said to himself, Oy li, woe unto me, Shema bishvil shesarachti olam, because of my sin that I ate from the Etz Hadat, from the forbidden tree, and affected the world, Hashuch be'adi, the world is growing darker sooner. Maybe this darkness is descending upon me because of the fact that I brought destruction to the world. A world that's growing darker and darker as the days pass. Bechozer letohu vavohu. Maybe the world is going back to its primordial chaos, the chaos and the emptiness that existed before the world was created. Bezohi mitah sheniknesa alai min hashamayim. Maybe that's the punishment of death that was decreed upon me from heaven. What happened? Amad v'yashav chet yamim beta'anit u'betfilah. As the days were getting shorter, Adam began to fast and pray for 8 straight days. Very interesting. Kevan sha'at kufat tevet, but when he saw the arrival of the month of Tevet, v'ra'a yom shema'arich ve'olech, and he suddenly saw a day that's, beginning to get a little longer. He said, Minhago shel olam hu. Oh wow, I think I made a mistake in my previous calculation. It seems that this is just the way the world works. This is just the cycle of nature, where there are times that the day becomes dark sooner, and other times where the day gets longer. Halach ve'asa shmone yamim tovim. After that, Adam went and celebrated another 8 days for that incident. And l'shana acheret, the following year, asan le'elu ve'le'elu yamim tovim. After that, he made both sets of these 8 days, which is the days before the solstice, when he initially fasted and thought that the world was coming to an end, and the days after the solstice, when he celebrated because he realized that the days were getting longer. He turned both those sets of 8 days into days of celebration. And then the Gemara adds, almost in passing, that Adam HaRishon, the very first man, did what? Kav'am l'shem shamayim. He established those 2 sets of holidays as chagim, as holidays for God, and he did it l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven. But the idolaters who came after him, those pagans who celebrated Adam's original holidays, they came along and turned them into the holidays of Kalanda and Saturnura. It was the pagans who revamped Adam's original and pure intended holidays, and instead of offering praise and thankfulness to God, they began to worship the stars. L'shem avodat kochavim. Wow. You hear this? You hear this? According to this Gemara, these 2 pagan holidays of Kalanda and Saturnura were actually perversions of earlier holidays that were established by none other than the very first man, Adam HaRishon, in honor of God. Do you know what's very interesting? This entire discussion in the Gemara that we just learned very much resembles that first Gemara that we discussed in the beginning of the shiur that talks about Hanukkah. If you'd put these two Gemariot side by side and then compare them, the similarities are amazing. So let's analyze the Gemara of Avodah Zarah once more, which describes these 8-day festivities, these pagan festivals that take place smack in the middle of the winter. So if we analyze the Gemara of Avodah Zarah, which we just went over, that describes these 8-day festivals, these pagan festivals that take place smack in the middle of the winter, we'll notice that with regards to Chanukah, our Rabbanim also talk about an 8-day festival that takes place smack in the middle of the winter. And I want you to notice the words of these two passages in the Gemara. Concerning Adam's solstice holidays, how do the Rabbanim describe it? They say, Leshana acheret. The following year, Asan le'elu ve'le'elu yamim tovim. Adam turned both of those sets of 8-day periods into holidays. Those words are almost identical to the words of the first passage of the Gemara that we learned at the onset of the shiur. When the Rabbanim are describing the establishment of Hanukkah as a holiday, what do they write in that Gemara, that first one that we learned? Leshana acheret. You hear the same words? The following year, after the miracle of the oil, kav'um ve'asum yamim tovim. The rabbis established these 8 days as festive days. You see the similarities? The phrase Leshana acheret kav'um ve'asum yamim tovim is a phrase that resembles the Chachamim's description of Adam's holidays. So the more we analyze these two passages from the Gemara, the more we see the similarities between them, because it's not just the idea of an 8-day winter holiday that connects them. It's not even the language that the Rabbanim use to describe the establishment of these holidays. It's the fact that there's significance in the way the Rabbanim characterize the holiday of Hanukkah that reminds us of Adam's holiday. Think about it. Think of the idea of the falling of darkness and then the increasing of light. Remember how Adam was watching the world becoming increasingly dark, but then when the process began to reverse itself, he actually saw the sunlight hours increasing, and that's when he decided to celebrate for 8 days. Remember that? Does that remind you in any way of Hanukkah? Think darkness, and then think increasing light, and an 8-day celebration to mark it. That definitely reminds us of Hanukkah, because how do we celebrate Hanukkah? Don't we light one candle the first night, the next night a second candle, and then we keep increasing the candles? More light, night after night, until on the 8th night we have an illuminated room. And the Rabbanim tell us that the reason we increase one candle at a time is because that small amount of oil that looked like it was only going to last and burn for one day, and then after that day there'd be no more light in the Bet HaMikdash, where it was supposed to be dark and cold, where the Maccabean would have then been enveloped by the darkness. We know that then a miracle happened. Na'asa bones ve'idliku mimeno shmona yamim. That oil lasted for 8 days. So you know what we learned from this? That the light kept shining on in the face of darkness. So we celebrate that increased light that was in the Bet HaMikdash by lighting a menorah in our homes, and we increase the amount of light in our homes day after day. So knowing this, Doesn't our celebration of Hanukkah remind us of Adam's celebration? The retreat of darkness and the gift of increasing light? On Hanukkah, we're celebrating the fact that miraculously the light came back after it appeared as if it was going away for good. And now let's discuss one more parallel, the fasting in the morning. Remember how we were confused about how the Rabbanim described Hanukkah, that they described it as 8 days where we don't fast or eulogize the dead, and we wondered, why was it so important to mention, and why did the Rabbanim define Hanukkah based on this description? Well, believe it or not, that idea also appears in Adam's holidays dating back to the beginning of creation. Because what exactly did Adam do during that very first winter of creation? He saw the world getting dark, and he was afraid of its destruction. He was afraid of its imminent death. And in response to that danger, he fasted for 8 days, and he declared something while he fasted. What did he say? He said, "Oy li, woe unto me, I've destroyed the world." Do you know what he was really doing? Adam was fasting and preemptively eulogizing the dead, which means that he was eulogizing over himself and over the entire world even before it was destroyed, or so he thought it was going to be destroyed. So fascinatingly, the definition that the Rabbanim give of Hanukkah seems to originate from Adam's very first Chagim, when he fasted and mourned, as he preemptively lamented what might very well be his own death. And then he stopped lamenting when light returned and his hope in the future was restored. And every year on Hanukkah, we abstain from fasting and mourning just like he did. But what does that all mean? I mean, we have all of these parallels between the Rabbanim's description of Adam's Chagim and their description of Hanukkah, and I want to know what all of these connections signify at the end of the day. I mean, it is true that Hanukkah has light and darkness, and Adam's holidays had light and darkness. But so what? What's the big deal? It still doesn't seem that Hanukkah is fundamentally connected to Adam's holiday. Hanukkah is about our military victory over the Greeks. It's about the miracle of the oil. But Adam's holidays were about being scared that the world was coming to an end. So why would the Chachamim suggest that there's even a remote connection between the two? Obviously, there's something deeper to explore. And I feel that the Rabbanim were actually touching upon a fear that's so basic, so fundamentally human, that it relates back to the very first person who ever walked the earth. Because Hanukkah and Adam's holidays are both about a frightening encounter with darkness and an attempt by humans to respond to that darkness. So let's talk about Adam for a moment. What exactly was he afraid of when he first experienced the fading sunlight of winter? The Gemara uses a certain language to describe Adam's response to the increasing darkness. It states, Shema bishvil shesarachti olam, because I brought devastation to the world through my sin, choshech be'adi, darkness is now descending upon the world. Vechozer letohu vavohu, and maybe God is returning the world to the emptiness that existed before he formed this beautiful world. Adam thought that creation itself is actually being undone. And perhaps he had a good reason for thinking what he did, because if we go back to the very beginning of the Torah, to the description of the world's beginning, and that original tohu vavohu, What does the pasuk state? Ve'ha'aretz hayta tohu vavohu. And the world was in the state of primordial chaos. Ve'choshech al penei tehom. And darkness was upon the face of the deep. Ve'ruach Elokim merachefet al pnei hamayim. And the Spirit of God hovered upon the face of the waters. Notice that description. There's water everywhere. There's darkness, and there's a ruach. There's a wind and or Hashem's Spirit. What does that remind you of? Darkness, water, wind, ruach. It's like a winter storm. When Adam experiences his first winter, he was seeing a scary reflection of that primordial winter, kiviyachol, of the tohu vavohu, of the chaos, of lifelessness coming into being all around him. Adam was afraid of the dark, but there was something he feared even more. You see, in Adam's mind, Hashem, the Creator, the source of all of this, of all life, he felt was retreating and withdrawing from the world that he created. So put yourself in Adam's shoes. What was it like to experience that fear? Here you are, setting your feet on earth for the first time. You wake up, and it's a new and beautiful world that you marvel at. You're just, it's just breathtaking. You're taken by the heavens, by the blue skies, the lavish trees and plant life. You hear the sounds of birds and animals roaming the earth. You're actually being sustained by this fertile earth, the ground of life from which you were born. And you receive nourishment from the sweet fruit of the trees, and vegetation is growing all around you. But as the days move forward, you begin to notice a startling pattern. Ever since you ate from that one tree that God commanded you not to eat from, those dark nights seem to be getting longer. And the days of light seem to be getting shorter and shorter. And then you remember that Hashem warned you about eating from that tree, and He said that it would bring death to the world. And suddenly, this awesome fear takes hold of you, and you're thinking, oh, maybe this is what God meant. The world must be dying. And the giver of all of this, the giver of all life, is leaving. And do you know what the world looks like when you think that God is retreating? The days are growing colder and darker. The energy is flowing out of this once vibrant world. Green leaves are turning brown. They're rotting and dying. Trees that were once vibrant are now just bones. The trees that once gave you fruit are not providing fruit anymore. The soil that was soft and fertile is now dead and hard. The sun that provided the world with light, with warmth and energy seems to be slipping away day by day. And how does Adam react to this terrible realization? He begins to fast, to mourn, and to eulogize the dying world. When Adam believes that Hashem is retreating from the world, he loses all hope. Seeing the world withering around him made him despair. And then after 8 days of his mourning and fasting and praying, something incredible happened. He realized that the sun began to shine just a little bit longer than it did the day before. When Adam saw this, all of a sudden brought him out of this terrible fear. he realized that Hashem had not abandoned the world after all. Hashem never left his world, and he realized that Hashem never left him. Adam realized that the darkness that he was experiencing was just minhago shel olam. It was just the way of the world, just part of the cycle of nature. The world was just now cycling back into more and more light. And then he knew it was going to be okay. So Adam celebrated that moment. And then the following year, when winter rolled around again, he established 2 holidays. Not just a holiday during the days of increasing light, but also a holiday during the 8 days of increasing darkness. He was celebrating the lesson that he learned the last winter. What lesson was that? It was the lesson that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was with him in the darkness as much as he was with him in the light. HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't abandon his world. But what happened? Interestingly, a version of Adam's fear resurfaced later on in history, around the time of the Hanukkah story, during the era of the Greeks. At that moment in history, Hashem also seemed to be withdrawing, and the story of the Jewish people seemed to be coming to an end. Think about the Jewish people during the historical events leading up to Hanukkah. There was Hoshech everywhere. It was one of the darkest exiles. Eretz Yisrael was under Greek rule. There was no more prophecy. The right to practice our Torah HaKadoshah was being abolished. There were statues of foreign gods in the Beit HaMikdash, and the Greek culture was permeating every corner of the civilized world. And worse than that was that the enemy itself was hard to define. And what was the most depressing and dangerous was that many Jews decided to abandon their faith, and they became Greeks. They were known as Hellenists. This was a time where brother turned against brother. There was a civil war within Am Yisrael. For Am Yisrael as a nation, it was a moment of deep spiritual darkness. Just like night, it was hard to know what was what. Everything was so confusing and so frightening. The world that we knew was unraveling. And as the Jews of that time witnessed this new reality, they may just have felt Adam's fear. To them, it felt as if God had retreated from their world. And the question was this permanent? Did Hashem abandon us? Did he cast us away into the dark hands of the chaos of the Hellenists and of the Greek Empire? Hanukkah has an answer to that question. It isn't quite the same as Adam's answer, but it's as if the Maccabean's response to the darkness was a progression of Adam's response. The Maccabean were actually building on Adam's answer. What do I mean? Well, until now, we spoke about the similarities between Adam's holidays and Chanukah. But there are also differences, and those differences tell us something profound. What are the differences? Well, the Gemara gave us some clues already, and I want you to ask yourselves this question. In each story, Adam's story and the Hanukkah story, what's the source of light and who's responsible for that light? In Adam's story, the source of light is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's God. That's Adam's sun, so to speak. In the story of Chanukah, the source of light seems to be man. How? Because man is the one who kindles the flame. In Adam's holiday, he's celebrating a time when God lit up the sky for him. But Hanukkah commemorates a specific time in history where our people lit the menorah. In other words, in the story of Hanukkah, it's the people who were responsible for bringing light back to the world, and Hashem responded to that action by keeping the flames of the menorah burning. Not only that, but Adam celebrates the lasting light, and how does he describe it? He says, oh, you know, it's minhago shel olam, it's the natural order of things. There are cycles of light and cycles of darkness, and that's just the way God made the world, it's nature. But when the Maccabean celebrated the lasting of the menorah's light for 8 days, they weren't celebrating some natural cycle. They weren't celebrating the teva in the world. How does the Gemara describe it? Na'asa nes here. The Maccabean realized that there was a miracle being performed for them. They were celebrating the very opposite of Adam's phenomenon. They were actually celebrating the overturning of the cycles of the laws of nature. They were celebrating miracles. So what reason do you think that there is for these differences? And what do these differences tell us? Well, when it concerns Adam, it seems that he's celebrating the restoration of Hashem's light within nature, within the teva. Because God brings back the light, so to speak, right? He lengthens the day. But Hanukkah celebrates the revival of Hashem's light in a different world. What world? The world of history. You see, Adam's fear revolved around Hashem leaving the natural world, the world that he as a creator set up. But the Maccabean, on the other hand, their fear revolved around the possibility that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had abandoned the world of history, which means that Hashem was no longer present in the landscape of human affairs. And these two worlds are very different. The world of nature is fundamentally controlled by God, not man. God is the only one who sets up the way the whole world works. And Adam's deeds, they don't really change that for better or for worse. And that's Adam's realization. He realized that the increasing light is due to minhago shel olam. He realized that it's God who's regulating the movement of the heavenly spheres. Hashem is the one responsible for the orbits of the moon and the planets, which gives us the cycles of light and darkness in the world. It's Hashem who's responsible for the winters and for the summers. So Adam's initial mistake was that he thought that the world was growing dark because of his actions. And he was relieved when he realized that even though he had sinned, and he sinned gravely, Hashem would never leave him. That nature wasn't affected by his mistakes. The sun was still going to come out the next day, even if he had sinned. Hashem would never leave the world that he created, and Hashem would never leave him. That's the world of nature. That's the world of Adam. But when we discuss history, that idea is not so. You see, in the course of history, man's actions do indeed count. They count very much. History is the words, his story. His story. History. History is man's accounts of events. It's the story that we human beings weave together with our Creator. In that story, in the story of our history, we could either take steps towards Hashem, and then He can take steps towards us, or, God forbid, we can take a step back, and He can take a step back as well. So, what happens when we sense that God is retreating from our story, from history itself? That's the key question that the Maccabean faced. And their answer was not a repeat of Adam's answer. It wasn't. It was a reversal of Adam's answer. Because you see, Adam, what did he do? He fasted and he mourned the darkness. He eulogized over himself and the possible loss of the world. But the Maccabean, understood that in history, you can't afford to do that. Minhago shel olam won't come around and lift you out of the darkness. If we feel that Hashem is leaving us, chas v'shalom, we have to actually take action. We can't wait for the light to arrive to reassure us that God is here. On the contrary, if we want Hashem to be here, if we want to feel His presence, we need to invite Him back. We need to find a way to kindle some light of our own. And the truth is, it's a little more difficult than that. You see, we look at Adam, and then we look at Hanukkah, and we say, well, I mean, in the case of Adam, the source of light was Hashem, and in the case of Hanukkah, the source of light was man, because man kindled the light. So the moral of the story is that in history, man acts on his own. Isn't that what we're meant to learn? And the answer is no. No, that's not what you're meant to learn, because although it's true that man did kindle the lights of Hanukkah, it's not completely true that we were fully responsible for it. After all, it was Hashem who, through a miracle, kept that oil burning for 8 days. So on Hanukkah, Hashem partnered up with us in the creation of our own story. Hashem turned history, He turned man's story into the shared story of Him and us. So on Hanukkah, the Maccabean were correct in feeling that Hashem had taken a step back and removed Himself from the dealings of mankind. But the people didn't respond by eulogizing and by fasting. They responded by fighting. They chose to act, and they chose to bring back the light into the world rather than giving into that darkness. They chose to fight the battle, a battle that seemed futile. They chose to light the menorah, even if only for one day. And that act also seemed to be futile. But the Maccabean did what they did because they were convinced that these were not futile actions, even if the odds were stacked against them. They felt that what they were doing was something good, something right, something noble. The Maccabean invited Hashem back into the world as their partners. And Hashem responded in kind. He smiled on their efforts, and the war was won. The menorah stayed lit for 8 long days until humans were then able to gather together to find resources to process more pure oil. Ironically, Hashem's presence in our shared world of history can often shine even more brightly than Hashem's presence in the world of nature, the world that Hashem rules all by Himself. Why? You see, in nature, Adam saw Hashem's presence in a light that he thought was just minhago shel olam, it's just a function of the natural order of things, laws of nature. But look what happens when man invites Hashem back into history by lighting his own light. How does Hashem reciprocate in such a case? His reciprocation transcends the ways of the world and of the minhago shel olam. Hashem's involvement takes the form of what we call a nes, a miracle. The light of the menorah that was supposed to last one day lasted 8 days. That was a miracle. So was Mr. Morgenstern right? Well, he was kind of right. And he was very wrong. He was right because Hanukkah is a Jewish holiday that takes place in the winter. And it is indeed a modern day repetition of an ancient winter holiday that was decreed not by the pagans, but by the first human being, Adam HaRishon. But he was very wrong because Hanukkah isn't by any means an imitation of some pagan winter ritual. It's actually a departure from those rituals. Think about it. Adam wanted his holiday to mark Hashem's willingness to put a sense of order in the world that he created. But the pagans corrupted the vision of that order. How? Because they created a whole new religion. They looked at the stars and they looked at the nature of the stars, and they saw the journey of the stars through the heavens. And what did they say? The stars is as high as the heavens go. There's nothing beyond the stars. We should direct our worship to them. They were so wrong. So Adam's holidays weren't just merely corrupted when later generations began celebrating the stars and the moon and the orbits. But you know what happened as a result? The message of hope and renewal that Adam was trying to convey became undone. Adam's holidays were transformed into days that behind their joy, there was really despair and hopelessness. Because you know what it's like to live by the mercy of the blind forces of nature? It's a life of constant mourning. It's simply a temporary relief for a dark despair. It's the concept of, oh, eat, drink, and be merry today, for tomorrow we will die. How will we die? We're going to die alone in an uncaring world that's determined and governed by whom? This constellation, the stars, nature. So according to the pagan worldview, the solstice is a time that simply grants people, one more day, maybe even one more year of life under the unforgiving influences of the sun and the moon and the earth. But Hanukkah opposes all of that. It's a chag that further refines Adam's holidays rather than corrupting it. Chanukah stands for the notion that history is a world that's different than the world of nature. Yes, HaKadosh Baruch Hu imposed a certain set order on nature. True, there's a natural order of things. But the world of history, which is mankind's unfolding story, that's a world where goodness and justice are the shared province of Hashem and of man together. History is our story, and it's HaKadosh Baruch Hu's story together with us, and therefore we have to bear the responsibility of taking the first step, where if we sense a coldness or a growing evil in the world, if we sense that there's a choshech, a darkness, if we feel that, God forbid, Hashem is withdrawing from our world, as sad as that is, we shouldn't give into that sadness. We shouldn't mourn, and we shouldn't eulogize over ourselves or anybody else or even the world. Instead, we have to seize the opportunity and act with responsibility. What do we have to do? We have to kindle a light. We have to ignite a flame, however futile it may seem. We have to invite Hashem back into our life, into our story. And if we do that, miracles can happen. So I want to wish you all, ladies, a beautiful and illuminating Chag, a Chanukah Sameach. And may this be the Chag that illuminates our path towards Hashem as it ushers in with it a new era of the ultimate light of Mashiach. Amen Ken, Yehi Ratzon.